My grandparents own a cabin in the Adirondacks, tucked away in a quiet patch of forest near a small lake. It's not fancy. It's a one-story structure with creaky floors, old furniture, and a fireplace that sometimes belches smoke back into the room. But it's always been our family's escape. The cabin has been in the family for decades, long before I was born, and even though it's pretty run down, my parents insist it has character. This story takes place about 10 years ago, when I was 12, and my sister Mia was 14. My family decided to spend Thanksgiving up at the cabin, which was something we hadn't done before. The drive up was brutal. Heavy snow made the narrow mountain roads treacherous, and it was already dark by the time we arrived. The first night was uneventful, mostly because my mom kept us all huddled indoors, saying the storm was too bad to even think about exploring. But the next morning, the snow had stopped, and the entire forest looked magical under its thick white blanket. Mia and I bundled up and went outside to play. The cabin sat on a hill overlooking the lake, with woods stretching out on either side. There was a faint trail that wound down to the lake, and we decided to follow it to see if it was frozen over. As we trudged through the snow, we started a little game of track the animal, guessing which footprints in the snow belonged to deer, rabbits, or other creatures. When we reached the lake, Mia dared me to go out onto the ice. It was clearly frozen, but my parents had drilled into us not to trust ice unless it had been tested. I chickened out and Mia rolled her eyes, calling me a baby. That's when we noticed something strange. There were footprints leading onto the ice, but they weren't animal prints. They were human. The odd thing was that they started in the middle of the lake. It was as if someone had been dropped onto the ice from above. Mia and I stared at them, puzzled. Maybe someone went ice skating and the snow covered the rest of the tracks, she suggested. But there were no signs of blades scraping the ice, just the prints of heavy boots. We decided to follow them. They led across the lake and into the woods on the other side. The trail was faint in places, but it seemed to head toward an old hunting cabin we'd seen during a summer visit years before. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the woods were growing eerily quiet. The cabin looked abandoned. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and one of the windows was boarded up. But there was smoke coming from the chimney. I wanted to turn back, but Mia, ever the brave one, insisted we check it out. She knocked on the door, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response. The door creaked open slightly under her knock, and we could see the faint glow of a fire inside. "Maybe they're out hunting," Mia said, stepping inside. I stayed on the porch, too scared to follow her. A few seconds later, she came back out, her face pale. "We need to leave," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "What? What did you see?" I asked, panicking. "I don't know," she said. "There was just someone sitting in the corner. They didn't move or say anything. They were just watching me." We ran back through the woods as fast as we could, not caring about following the trail. By the time we got back to our cabin, it was fully dark, and our parents were frantic. We told them what had happened, and my dad decided to go check it out. He came back an hour later, looking shaken. "The cabin was empty," he said, "but the fire was still burning." Mia and I never went back to the other side of the lake again, and every winter after that we made sure to leave before the first snow fell. To this day, I can't explain those footprints or who or what Mia saw in that cabin. I've always loved hiking. Growing up, my family and I would spend weekends exploring trails and camping out in the wilderness. By the time I turned 22, I had hiked countless trails across my home state, often venturing into more remote areas to push myself further. This story happened during a hiking trip 3 years ago when I was 23 and in my last year of college. It was a late spring weekend, and my friends, Ethan, Josh, and Liam, and I decided to drive a few hours to explore a trail system near a national park. We'd read about a route called Raven's Ridge online. It wasn't officially listed in the park maps, but was well known among experienced hikers. It was supposedly challenging, with stunning views and a lesser-known camping spot halfway through. It sounded perfect. The first day was everything we hoped it would be. Long trails, breathtaking scenery, and that sense of isolation we all loved. By evening, we set up camp at the clearing we had heard about, nestled between towering pines. There wasn't a soul in sight, just how we liked it. The second day, we packed up and decided to take a detour Ethan had found on an online forum. According to his notes, this side trail would lead us to a secluded waterfall hidden deep in the forest. None of us had ever heard of it, and the idea of uncovering a hidden gem sounded thrilling. The trail started off narrow but was well trodden, so we followed it without much hesitation. A couple of hours in, we started noticing strange things. Empty water bottles, a torn hiking boot, and even a shredded backpack left by the side of the trail. At first, we chalked it up to careless hikers, but the farther we went, the stranger the items got. There were food wrappers, bits of rope, and, weirdly, a cracked compass. Liam joked that we'd stumbled into the remains of some kind of hiker ghost story, but I could tell the unease was spreading among us. Eventually, we came across an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. The paint was faded, but you could just make out the words, "Beware, private land." Josh pointed out that the trail still looked well used, so we decided to keep going. We figured we weren't far from the waterfall, and besides, who puts up a warning sign in the middle of nowhere? About 15 minutes later, we heard voices ahead. We rounded a bend to find two people, a man and a woman, sitting on a large rock next to the trail. They looked like they'd been hiking for a while. Their clothes were rugged, their faces smudged with dirt, and they each carried a large pack. The man smiled as we approached and introduced himself as Aaron. The woman, Lisa, gave a polite nod. They told us they were locals and had been hiking this area for years. Lisa asked if we were heading to the waterfall, and when we said yes, her eyes lit up. "It's just up ahead," she said, "but the trail's pretty tricky from here on. We can show you the way if you'd like." It seemed like a friendly offer, but something about them felt off. Maybe it was the way Lisa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, or the way Aaron kept glancing back down the trail, like he was expecting someone. Ethan, always the adventurous one, accepted their offer before the rest of us could voice our doubts. They led us farther into the forest, and true to their word, the trail did get harder to follow. Roots snaked across the path, and dense underbrush made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Aaron and Lisa seemed to move effortlessly, like they knew the terrain by heart. We must have walked for another 20 minutes when we came to a clearing. Instead of the promised waterfall, there was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Boards missing from the walls, windows shattered, and the door hanging off its hinges. "This doesn't look like a waterfall," Josh said, his voice tense. Aaron laughed. "The waterfall's just behind the cabin," he said. "We thought you might want to check this out first. It's kind of a local legend." None of us moved. Something about the situation was screaming at me to leave. The clearing was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our breathing. "Maybe we should head back," Liam said finally. "It's getting late." Lisa frowned. "What's the rush?" she said. "You came all this way, at least take a look inside." Ethan, always the bold one, started walking toward the cabin. I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, keeping my voice low. "This doesn't feel right." Before he could argue, we heard movement behind us, branches snapping, heavy footsteps. We turned to see 3 more men emerging from the trees. They were big, dressed in rough clothes, and carried what looked like tools. An axe, a crowbar, and a length of chain. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some friendly group of hikers. Aaron's cheerful demeanor vanished. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice cold. The next few moments were a blur. Liam shouted for us to run, and we bolted back, the way we came. I could hear the men yelling behind us, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. The trail was nearly impossible to navigate at full speed, but adrenaline kept us moving. Somehow we managed to lose them, diving off the trail and hiding behind a cluster of boulders. We stayed there for what felt like hours, barely breathing until we were sure they were gone. When we finally made it back to the main trail, the sun was setting, and we didn't stop until we reached the safety of the parking lot. We reported the encounter to the park rangers, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run when we did, or if we hadn't been fast enough. Sometimes, when I'm out hiking, I still think about that cabin in the woods and the people who led us there. I'll never forget the look in Aaron's eyes when he told us we weren't leaving. We were lucky that day, but not everyone might be. This is going to sound strange, but bear with me. Every summer, my friends Jake, Ellie, and I have this little tradition. We drive out to an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It's not on any map, and the locals always warn us to stay away, saying it's not a place for kids. That just made it more appealing to us when we were younger. Even now, in our early 20s, we still go back every year. It's a bit of a dare, a bit of nostalgia, and honestly, just something to do when the summer nights get too quiet. We don't do anything crazy out there, no breaking windows, no vandalism. We just sit on the crumbling porch, tell stories, and take in the eerie vibe of the place. There's something about the stillness, the way the wind cuts through the tall grass, and the faint smell of old wood and rust. It feels like stepping into another world. This happened last July. It was late, maybe around midnight, when we pulled up in Jake's beat-up old Jeep. The farmhouse was just as we remembered it. Dark, silent, and leaning slightly to one side like it was too tired to stand upright. The moon was almost full, casting enough light for us to see the overgrown field that stretched out behind the house. Ellie brought a flashlight, but we didn't need it at first. The moonlight was bright enough to guide us. We set up on the porch, passing around a bag of chips and joking about the creepy stories we'd told there in years past. For a while, it was just fun and laughter, the kind of night that makes you forget about anything outside that little bubble of time and place. Then Jake froze mid-sentence. He was staring out toward the field. "You see that?" he whispered. Ellie and I turned to look. At first, I thought he was messing with us, but then I saw it too. Something moving in the tall grass, maybe 100 yards away. It was dark, hard to make out against the shadows, but it was there. "Probably a deer," Ellie said, though her voice wavered. Jake shook his head. "Too big. And it's standing up." That's when I felt it. That cold, sinking feeling you get when you know something isn't right. The figure wasn't just standing. It was swaying slightly like it was trying to stay upright. And it was watching us. We sat there, silent, too scared to move. The only sound was the rustling of the grass and the occasional creak of the porch beneath us. Then, it started walking. Not toward us, but along the edge of the field, like it was circling the house. It moved slowly, deliberately, almost like it wanted us to see it. As it got closer, I realized it wasn't walking, it was limping. One leg dragged behind it, leaving a faint trail in the grass that glimmered in the moonlight. Jake whispered, "We should go." But none of us moved. We just watched as the figure reached the far corner of the field and stopped. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, swaying and staring, before it dropped to all fours and started crawling. Fast. That was all it took. We bolted for the Jeep, scrambling over each other in our rush to get inside. Jake floored it, and the tires kicked up gravel as we sped away. I looked back just once. The figure was standing again, still watching, still swaying, its dark silhouette framed by the moonlight. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What could we say? Jake dropped me off first, and as I got out, he muttered, "Don't go back there, man." I haven't. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure in the field. What it was, what it wanted, and why, as we drove away, I could have sworn I saw it smile. This story still keeps me awake at night, and every winter it feels like the memories get sharper, cutting through the haze of time. It happened 4 years ago, in the dead of January. I was living alone in a small cabin in the woods, about a half-hour's drive from the nearest town. I'd moved there after a rough breakup, wanting to clear my head and find some peace. The place was perfect for that. Isolated, quiet, and surrounded by dense forest. Winters in that area were brutal. By mid-December, everything was blanketed in snow, and the temperatures rarely crept above freezing. I was used to it, though. The cabin had a wood-burning stove, and I always made sure to stock up on firewood and supplies before the first big storm. One night, a storm hit harder than I'd ever seen. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, shaking the cabin and rattling the windows. Snow piled up quickly, burying my porch steps and making it impossible to see more than a few feet outside. I stayed inside, curled up near the stove with a book, trying to ignore the eerie creaks and groans of the old cabin as the storm battered it. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like knocking. I froze, straining my ears. It was hard to tell where it was coming from, but it didn't seem like it was at the door. It was softer, more distant. I told myself it was just a branch hitting the side of the cabin. But then it happened again, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. It was definitely coming from the front door. My heart started pounding. Who in their right mind would be out in a storm like this? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one ever came out here unannounced. Grabbing a flashlight and a fire poker, I crept to the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for some kind of response. But all I heard was the wind. Finally, I worked up the nerve to open the door. No one was there. The snow on the porch was untouched, pristine except for the thick layer still falling. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, scanning the trees and the driveway, but there was nothing. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. Feeling uneasy, I locked the door and double-checked all the windows. I told myself it must have been the storm playing tricks on me, and eventually I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, the snow glittering under a pale blue sky. I bundled up and went outside to shovel the steps and clear a path to the driveway. As I worked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints. They were faint, almost erased by the fresh snow, but they were definitely there. A single set of tracks leading from the woods to my front porch, and then back into the woods. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see a face staring back at me from the trees. I didn't go outside again until nightfall, when I had to bring in more firewood. That's when I saw it. Something was hanging from a tree at the edge of the woods, swaying gently in the wind. My flashlight beam caught it, a small, crude wooden figure, like a voodoo doll, tied together with string. It was hanging from a branch, just high enough that it would have been visible from my bedroom window. I I felt sick. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire poker by my bed and stayed awake, listening for any sound outside. But the night was silent, and when the sun finally rose, I forced myself to go outside and take the figure down. Up close, it was even more unsettling. It had a tiny face carved into it, and the string that bound it was smeared with something dark and crusty. I burned it in the stove and tried to convince myself it was some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, more strange things started happening. I'd wake up to find my firewood pile knocked over, the logs scattered across the snow. Once I found scratches on the side of the cabin, long and jagged, like something had been clawing at the wood. And every night, just after sunset, I'd hear the knocking again. It always came in threes. The final straw came a week later. I was outside chopping firewood, trying to pretend everything was normal, when I heard a noise behind me. A low, guttural growl. I spun around, the axe in my hands, but there was nothing there. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure was standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden behind a tree. It was tall, thin, and wrapped in tattered, filthy clothes. Its face was obscured by some kind of mask, wooden with hollow eyes and a twisted, grinning mouth. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I dropped the axe and ran inside, locking the door and grabbing my phone. But there was no signal. There never was out here. I spent the rest of the day locked in the cabin, jumping at every sound, too scared to even look out the windows. By the time night fell, I'd made up my mind. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and bolted for the Jeep. The drive to town was a blur, my heart racing the entire way. I never went back to the cabin. A few weeks later, I heard on the news that a body had been found in the woods near my old place. A hiker, they said, who'd frozen to death during the storm. But the details didn't add up. The hiker's body was found miles from any trail, and according to the report, he'd been wearing a wooden mask. This happened 2 winters ago, and to this day, I still get chills whenever I think about it. My friend Jake had recently inherited his grandfather's cabin up in the mountains, and he invited a few of us, me, our buddy Tim, and Jake's girlfriend Mia, to spend a weekend up there. It was late January, and the idea of cozying up in a cabin with a roaring fire and a few drinks sounded perfect. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The road leading up to it was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for one car. As we got closer, the snow started falling harder, and by the time we reached the cabin, everything was blanketed in white. The cabin itself was rustic but charming. It had a stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and big windows that looked out onto the endless forest. Jake told us his grandfather had built the place himself back in the 60s, and that it hadn't been used much since he passed away a few years ago. That first night was great. We cooked dinner, played cards, and drank way too much wine. By the time we went to bed, the snowstorm outside had picked up, and the wind howled through the trees like some kind of wild animal. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. The cabin was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as I made my way down the hall. As I was heading back to bed, I glanced out the window and froze. There were footprints in the snow. They started at the edge of the forest and led straight to the cabin, stopping right below the window I was looking out of. My stomach dropped. We hadn't seen another person since we'd arrived, and the idea of someone being out there in the middle of the night was unsettling. I woke Jake and told him what I'd seen. At first, he thought I was messing with him, but when he saw the look on my face, he grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out. The two of us bundled up and stepped outside, the freezing air biting at our skin. The footprints were still there, partially obscured by the falling snow, but unmistakable. They were large, booted prints, and they circled the cabin before disappearing back into the woods. "Probably just some hunter or hiker," Jake said, though his voice wavered. "Let's just lock the doors and go back to bed." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. The next morning, the footprints were gone, buried under a fresh layer of snow. We tried to laugh it off over breakfast, but the tension lingered. Mia suggested we go for a hike to clear our heads, and we agreed, thinking it might help us shake the weird vibe. The trail behind the cabin was beautiful, winding through snow-covered trees and offering occasional glimpses of the valley below. But the further we went, the quieter it got. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, it was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. About a mile in, Tim stopped suddenly. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all stood still, straining to listen. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then it came. A faint, high-pitched whistling, like someone blowing through a broken flute. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, and every hair on my body stood on end. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We turned back after that, none of us wanting to stick around any longer than necessary. That night, things got worse. It was around midnight when we heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Jake grabbed the fireplace poker, and Tim picked up a kitchen knife. We all crowded in the living room, too scared to turn on the lights. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then something heavy slammed against the door, hard enough to rattle the hinges. Mia let out a small scream, and Jake shouted, "Who's out there?" No response. Another slam, louder this time, and then nothing. We stayed huddled together for what felt like hours, jumping at every little noise. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and we fell asleep in the living room, the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. The next morning, we found scratches on the door, long and jagged, as if something with claws had been trying to get in. The snow outside was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. We packed up and left that afternoon, cutting our trip short. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. A few weeks later, Jake called me. He sounded shaken. "Remember that cabin?" he asked. "Of course," I said. "Well, I was going through some of my grandfather's old stuff, and I found something weird. A journal. He wrote about hearing strange noises at night and seeing figures in the woods. He even mentioned footprints around the cabin." I didn't know what to say. Jake continued. "The last entry said something about how it only comes in the winter. He wrote, 'The snow calls it.'" Neither of us talked much after that, and I haven't been back to the cabin since. To this day, I don't know what was out there that night. A person? An animal? Something else entirely? All I know is that I never want to find out.